It's wonderful to be here. I want to take you back to the night of December the 12th, 2015, in Le Bourget in Paris. I was very privileged to be in the front row when Laurent Fabius brought down the hammer to finalize the Paris Agreement. And some of you may have been there, but most people, of course, weren't. And I think it's a very, very special moment. So I wanted to share a little bit of that experience, of the ups and downs of the emotion of COP21. And then I want to explore what I think are some of the lessons that I've taken, that I'm trying to apply from the success of Paris in my work with businesses working on climate change, and share them with you. So, first of all, Le Bourget, there was 2 weeks of just insanely intense negotiations. Everyone there was working about 20 hours a day, hardly any sleep. A real emotional roller coaster from it's going to be an amazing deal to it's going to be a rubbish deal to the Americans are going to support ambition to the Saudis and the Venezuelans are going to pull it all down. And as I say, I worked quite closely with Christiana Figueres and her team, so she was kind enough to invite me into the front row. And as I was the first person in there, I was so excited. So there's like thousands of chairs behind me for all the representatives of the countries, and then behind them more NGOs. And as people came into that room, there was an amazing sense of excitement, kind of childish excitement almost. Everybody knew that the deal was going to be done. Everyone knew what the text was. Everyone knew that it was really ambitious. And you saw very serious people, John Kerry, Todd Stern, the representatives of India and China coming in and kind of high-fiving and hugging each other and taking selfies. There was a sort of party atmosphere. So there was real excitement. Everyone thought, we've done an amazing job here. Then we all sat down, and then Christiana Figueres and Laurent Fabius came in, and we thought it was going to very quickly be a formality, and then there'd be all the speeches congratulating everybody. And then nothing happened. And then people cleared from the stage, and suddenly the mood in the room went from real excitement to confusion and concern, and then almost fear, like, oh my God, maybe something's gone wrong, maybe this isn't going to happen. And that lasted 2 hours. So the room was full for 2 hours with no clue of what was really going on. People started standing up, and John Kerry went to the front of the stage, and there's a little huddle with the Americans and the Indians, and everyone's trying to understand what happened. Now, I can now reveal what happened because it's safe to do so. What had happened was there was a very minor mistake in the text that had been printed. In the most important article of the convention, there was a phrase which said the parties shall implement, when what had been agreed was the parties should. Now, that's a very tiny little nuance in English, but legally, it meant the difference between the President of the USA being able to, on his own, ratify the agreement, and the President of the USA having to take the agreement to Congress, which would have meant it never got ratified, if you know anything about American politics. So this tiny little textual mistake almost led to the collapse of the Paris Agreement at the last minute. But the challenge for the bureaucrats was, we can't just say this to everybody because then the whole world will be focused on this one word and this one change. So the 2 hours were about how do we work that out. In the end, they came up, Laurent Fabius introduced somebody who no one had seen, a technician or a technical manager in the UNFCCC, who explained that there had been a few minor textual errors in the rush to translate and print 40,000 copies. And Laurent Fabius invited him to quickly go through those. So everyone got their copy out, like 20 pages, and the gentleman said, okay, Article 1, Paragraph 2, if should be of. Article 2, Paragraph 3, there should be an indent in line 3. Article 3, shall should be should. Article 4, there should be a comma. So you saw everybody rushing through, trying to keep up, and nobody noticed the change. So a little bit of bureaucratic brilliance at the last minute from the UNFCCC and Laurent Fabius. And then, of course, the agreement was hammered through, and everyone cheered, and then the selfies and the hugging and the high five started again. And for me, this may become the treaty that is the most important and the most impressive multilateral treaty that humans have ever made. Time will tell, but it's certainly one of the most powerful multilateral attempts. And for me, the success rested on something that I want to describe now that I call the diplomacy of love. It might not be the sort of language you expect talking about the role of business in climate change, but let me first of all illustrate it by something that happened straight after that. And then I'll explain a little bit of some of the elements of that I'm trying to implement in my work. Straight after the agreement, the parties, the different countries, were invited to say a few words. The first person to speak was a representative of the small island states, the countries who shout 1.5 to stay alive, the countries for whom this really is existential. And the representative of the small island states spoke to Laurent Fabius, and there was a screen like 10 meters wide right in front of me, so I could see his face like 5 meters wide, with all the emotion. And he looked Laurent Fabius in the eye and he said, "Dear Laurent, I want you to know on behalf of the people of the small island states that today we feel listened to for the first time." Today we feel listened to for the first time. So something very powerful happened in Paris, and I call that the diplomacy of love. So let me explain what I mean by that. There are three elements of what I call diplomacy of love. The first is distributed leadership. The second is courageous connection. And the third is radical hope. So distributed leadership, how did that manifest in Paris? Well, the biggest transformation that made Paris a success was to give up the idea that anyone was in charge or that a top-down approach could work. And for me, this is so important in all of our work about trying to change systems. No one is in charge, and top-down approaches alone cannot work. What happened in Paris? In Peru, the United Nations system gave up trying to force something top-down and invited the best of every country. And I know that the UNFCCC only expected about 60 countries to come forward with plans. In the end, 175 did, and they were way more ambitious. The other thing the UN did was to say it's not just about countries, and to invite in businesses and cities and states and regions and recognize that there's leadership all over the place. No one's in charge, top-down doesn't work. And in my work with the We Mean Business Coalition, it's a coalition of organizations, this is something I battle with all the time. How do we empower each other and allocate responsibility to each other and get out of each other's way when it's quite natural to want to control and want to be in charge and want to be the one who's seen to succeed? And it's a real challenge in movements like the climate change movement to acknowledge the leadership of others rather than always want to take the leadership for oneself. The second element is what I call courageous connection. And again, you could see this just another one of the little speeches just after the hammer came down was the representative from Venezuela, a Marxist country in a conference with a lot of capitalist countries. That's their perspective. And the woman who spoke, the representative from Venezuela, is famous in the climate circles for having, a few years ago, banged the table so hard to get attention that her hand bled, and then she put her hand up and said, "How much more Latin American blood will have to be spilt before we can have climate justice?" So quite a challenging character. Laurent Fabius had the genius to give her responsibility for drafting some of the last text. And she too stood up at the end and thanked him for allowing her and her comrades from Venezuela to play a key role in this treaty. In our own work, perhaps the best example for me of this, personally, I was told about a year ago I needed to spend more time in the mainstream, not always talking to climate change people. So I went along to a conference called Oil and Money Conference last year. And normally I go to climate events and I know lots of people and I feel really comfortable and really positive and I understand the language. I went to the Oil and Money Conference and I didn't know anybody and I felt like a little boy and I sat at the back and I was a little scared. And then a gentleman sat next to me and I got even more scared. I thought, oh no, I might have to speak to an oil guy. And then I spoke to him and you know, I think we're all challenged to reach out to people from other tribes. It's so comfortable to only speak to people who we agree with. And it's comfortable because if we speak to someone we don't agree with, we risk having to change our thinking. We risk being disappointed because maybe they are very contrary. But I came away knowing a little bit more about that industry and a little bit more about one individual. And I see this as so important in this next phase of our work. Another really good example, we held a conference in London a couple of months ago, and we had on stage the CEO of Suncor, Steve Williams, Canada's largest energy company, and Sephora Berman, one of Canada's leading environmental campaigners. She used to run Greenpeace's international climate work. So we had the CEO of a tar sands company and the leading climate campaigner on stage. You would think there'd be fireworks, that would be really, really sparking off each other. But they came to tell the story of 2 years of conversations behind closed scenes when those two groups of oil companies in Alberta and environmentalists came together to try and unlock the climate politics in Alberta. And that conversation, which led to both of them being criticized as traitors. You can imagine if you're a climate campaigner and you spend time talking to oil CEOs, your climate friends call you a traitor. Same thing if you're an oil CEO and you spend time talking to climate campaigners, your oil friends call you a traitor. So they had the courage to connect across that divide, and that led to one of the most progressive pieces of climate legislation in Alberta, a $30 ton on price on carbon, the phasing out of coal by 2030, and a basin-wide limit on emissions. So courageous connections, overcoming our desire to be right and engaging with those who have different opinions. And the third element of the diplomacy and love is what I call radical hope. Christiana Figueres embodies that. She calls it radical optimism. And in my work, this really started about 4 years ago. I was at CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. We were measuring companies and how well they performed on climate change. And I remember speaking with Bernhard Schwager from Bosch, who said to me, Nigel, why do you give anyone an A? Why do you give anyone an A grade, a top grade? And it was one of those questions where immediately I knew everything would have to change. Because what he was saying was, if companies aren't doing enough, then you shouldn't say they've got an A grade. So now we then invented something we call science-based targets, which is asking companies to commit to playing their part in implementing Paris, in implementing a below 2-degree world. When we started, everybody said, you're crazy. Why would any company do that? Because countries aren't doing that. There's no country that's implemented that kind of law, and companies have to follow the law. Well, so that radical hope, that imagination that something is possible, risking being called a fool because you didn't achieve it, that seems to be paying dividends. By Paris, we had 100 companies who'd made that commitment. I think next week at Climate Week in New York, we'll reach 200. There's now over 100 states and regions and many cities doing the same. So far, only 5 countries have submitted plans which are considered adequate to implement Paris. But nearly 200 companies, over 100 states and regions, and many cities. So there's a power in that radical hope that a solution is really possible, rather than playing small and just going incremental. I wanted to share another story about sailing across the Atlantic, but I'm running out of time. So just to sum up, I think that there are lots of lessons that we can learn from the Paris Agreement that I'm trying to embody in my work. They're all difficult because they mean needing to overcome the desire to be right, the desire to look good, the desire to avoid conflict. But I think that together, if we can implement radical hope, courageous connections, and the diplomacy of love, then we have a much better chance of delivering on the promise of Paris. Thank you. Thank you.